A little girl in a small coastal town just solved $1 billion Navy jet engine problem that 30 top engineers couldn't crack. Armed with nothing but her sharp eyes, quick thinking, and a sketch on a napkin, this little girl spotted the flaw that had grounded the military's pride and joy. But what happened next? The Navy didn't just fix the jet, they saw her for what she truly was, a brilliant mind, ready to change the game. This inspiring true story of a little girl who saved a jet will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The coastal town of Seabright Harbor clung to the edge of Maine like it had been carved from the rocks by stubborn hands. Salt-stained houses leaned into the wind, their paint faded to soft pastels by decades of ocean spray. Fishing trawlers bobbed in the narrow harbor, and the steady thrum of boat engines was as much a part of daily life as the cry of the gulls overhead. Commander Benjamin Cole eased his Navy-issue pickup into the gravel lot of Seabright Middle School. His uniform was immaculate, the deep blue jacket a sharp contrast to the gray November sky. Through the windshield, he spotted his 10-year-old daughter, Hazel, stepping through the school's front doors. Her stride was unhurried, her expression distant, as though she was still mentally taking apart some machine she'd left half-finished. "How was school, kiddo?" Benjamin asked as Hazel slid into the passenger seat, her backpack landing with a solid thunk. The sound of metal tools clinking inside made him raise an eyebrow. "Mr. Dyer told me I can't keep a torque wrench in my locker," she said, her tone flat, as though she'd heard the same complaint more times than she could count. Apparently, working on the snowblower isn't an acceptable recess activity. Benjamin smirked as he steered toward the outskirts of town, where his father's old boathouse sat on the rocky shore. Caleb Cole, a retired Navy mechanic with 40 years under his belt, had turned it into a workshop packed with boat engines, propeller assemblies, and a wall of tools organized with military precision. It was here Hazel had learned to distinguish the healthy hum of an engine from the faint knock that meant trouble was coming. What she didn't know yet was that, by the end of the week, her knack for fixing things would pull her into a problem that had left 30 of the Navy's top engineers utterly stumped. The Cole Boathouse workshop always smelled faintly of salt water and motor oil, a mix that Benjamin Cole had long since accepted as the scent of home. Hazel trailed after him as they stepped inside, the chilly Atlantic wind rattling the corrugated metal siding. Caleb Cole, Benjamin's father, was already bent over a disassembled outboard motor, his weathered hands moving with the ease of a man who had spent 4 decades making sure engines didn't fail when lives depended on them. He straightened when he saw them, wiping his palms on a rag that had been washed so many times it was more gray than white. "Afternoon," Caleb greeted. "Hazel, if you're looking for a puzzle, I've got the carburetor from the Mariner's Pride acting up in ways that make no sense." Hazel's eyes lit up instantly, the same way other kids might at the mention of cake or snow days. "What's it doing?" "Runs fine at low speed," Caleb said, leading her over to the workbench, "but stumbles when you throttle up. Checked the obvious things: fuel pressure, spark timing, valves, they're all good." Hazel leaned over the open housing, her small fingers tracing the fuel lines like a pianist running a scale. "Did you check the accelerator pump diaphragm? Tiny cracks can mess it up without showing in static tests." Caleb's eyebrows rose. "Can't say I have. Let's take a look." Benjamin watched with the usual mix of pride and unease. Hazel's mind worked differently, fast, methodical, and curious to the point of defiance, but it set her apart in a town where most girls her age were more interested in phone screens than piston rings. That's when Benjamin's phone buzzed, the caller ID reading Naval Air Station Halifax. His gut tightened. Calls from the base during off hours were never social. "Commander Cole," he answered, his voice slipping into the clipped precision that years in uniform had drilled into him. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Morrison, and it carried an edge Benjamin didn't like. "We've got an emergency with the VX-92 prototype. Total thrust loss mid-test. We're grounding it until further notice." Benjamin's gaze sharpened. The VX-92 was the Navy's next-generation maritime patrol aircraft, a billion-dollar leap in technology. Losing thrust mid-flight wasn't just a glitch. It was a nightmare. "What's the damage?" The test pilot got her down safe, but the data's clean engine parameters were all nominal. 30 of our best engineers have been through it in the last 48 hours. No one can explain why it won't push air. Benjamin felt the old knot of urgency settle in. In the military, no explanation was code for career ender if it wasn't fixed fast. "You want me on base, so now, priority Alpha." He hung up and grabbed his jacket. "Dad, Hazel, stay here. I've got to get to the base." Hazel frowned. "Is this about the test plane I saw flying low over the harbor yesterday?" Benjamin didn't answer, but she caught the flicker in his expression. "Something like that," he said, heading for the truck. By the time he reached the base, the November sky had deepened into slate, and floodlights blazed over the flight line. Security was doubled, and the prototype sat in its hangar, surrounded by more uniforms and contractors than Benjamin had seen in one place all year. Inside the operations center, Captain Morrison stood over a table littered with flight data printouts. "We've run every standard diagnostic," he said grimly. "Fuel systems clean, ignition's perfect, computers happy. But when we throttle up, thrust drops to zero like the engines are breathing into a brick wall." Benjamin scanned the reports. Everything on paper looked flawless. And yet the bird might as well have been a sculpture for all the power it produced. He'd seen his share of weird failures. But this was in a class of its own. As engineers tossed theories back and forth, Benjamin's thoughts flicked back to Hazel's earlier question and to the way she always started by looking at what actually happened, not what was supposed to happen. If 30 top minds had failed in 2 days, maybe what the Navy needed wasn't more expertise. Maybe they needed a different set of eyes entirely. The next evening, Seabright Harbor's only diner. The Lighthouse Grill was busier than usual. Locals gathered in booths, their conversations weaving in and out of the same subject, the mysterious engine failure at the Naval Air Station. Benjamin's return to the base had stirred speculation, and the tight-knit fishing town thrived on little more than gossip, coffee, and clam chowder. Hazel sat in the corner booth with her grandfather, Caleb. Their dinner plates pushed aside to make room for a spread of engine diagrams on paper napkins. She'd already diagnosed the fishing boat carburetor earlier that afternoon, but her mind had been elsewhere since overhearing her father's tense phone call. "Grandpa," she asked, her voice low but focused, "what would make a jet engine run perfectly but not push the plane forward?" Caleb leaned back, considering. He'd taught Hazel everything from how to gap spark plugs to how to listen for the faint rattle of a bad bearing. But this was a different arena. Thrust comes from pushing air backward. If the engine runs but doesn't make thrust, something's wrong with how the air's moving. Either it's not getting in, it's not getting accelerated, or it's not getting out. Hazel stared at his quick sketch of a jet's airflow path. So, if the air goes in and out fine when it's sitting on the ground, but fails in the air, maybe something changes once it's moving fast. Across the diner, Principal Rose Whitaker walked in, scanning the room for familiar faces. She waved at Caleb and Hazel before settling at the counter. Moments later, Hazel was out of her booth and standing beside her. "Principal Whitaker," she asked bluntly, "do you think the Navy would let a kid look at that broken jet?" The principal's brow lifted. "Hazel, I'm sure they've got the best experts in the country working on it. That's not exactly a field trip kind of situation. But what if they're all thinking the same way and missing something obvious?" Hazel pressed. Before Whitaker could answer, the diner's door opened again. And in walked Noah Price, a high school senior who liked to hang around the docks and tinker with anything that had an engine. He overheard Hazel's question as he approached their booth. "If that's the VX-92 you're talking about, my uncle says they've flown in specialists from 3 different aerospace companies, and none of them can figure it out." Hazel slid a napkin toward him, showing her airflow diagram. If it runs fine but doesn't push, then either the air's being blocked or messed up somehow before it leaves the engine. Could be something about the way the plane moves through the air. Noah leaned over. Intrigued. "You mean like the plane's own shape messing with the engine's air?" "Exactly," Hazel said, her eyes alight, like turbulence in the wrong place. If you've got an air intake and wing design that don't match perfectly, they could cancel each other out at high speed. Across the table, Caleb watched her, pride mingling with concern. He'd seen that look before, the expression Hazel wore when she was zeroing in on a solution nobody else had spotted yet. Maxine, the diner's owner, paused while refilling coffee. "You know, Hazel, I heard the prototype's been locked up tighter than a submarine hatch. If they'd take your advice, you'd be the youngest consultant in Navy history." Hazel grinned. "I don't care about that. I just want to see it running. Sometimes you can see the problem before the sensors do." Noah whistled softly. "You sound like my uncle when he's diagnosing boats look before you measure." Before they could continue, the diner's old landline rang. Maxine answered, nodded, then called across the room. "Benjamin. It's for you, Captain Morrison." Benjamin's voice was tense when he came over from the counter. "Yeah. Morrison. Right now, all right. I'll be there in 15. He hung up and looked at Caleb. "They're doing another test run tonight. Want to come?" Hazel's head snapped up. "Can I?" Benjamin hesitated. "This isn't a sightseeing trip. It's classified work." But Caleb caught the flicker in his son's eyes. Benjamin had seen 30 experts fail. Maybe, just maybe, he was wondering if a fresh pair of eyes, no matter how young, could spot something they couldn't. The night air at Naval Air Station Halifax was sharp with the smell of jet fuel and ocean brine. Sodium floodlights bleached the runway in pale gold, casting long shadows over the VX-92 prototype as technicians moved in brisk, purposeful lines. Hazel had never seen anything like it up close, sleek, silver gray, and bristling with quiet menace. Benjamin had reluctantly agreed to let her tag along, under one condition: observe only. She wore a bright orange visitor's vest that practically screamed outsider. But the moment she stepped into the hangar, she forgot about everything except the aircraft in front of her. Captain Morrison glanced up from a bank of monitors when they entered. "Commander, I thought you said you were bringing your father." "Not." He trailed off, eyes shifting to Hazel. "My daughter," Benjamin said evenly. "She's just here to watch." Quietly. Hazel didn't say anything, but her eyes darted over every curve and edge of the VX-92, lingering on the intakes just forward of the wings. She had expected them to be large and unobstructed. Instead, they seemed tucked back at an angle that would feed perfectly still air on the ground, but maybe not at 300 knots. On the far side of the hangar, a cluster of engineers from an aerospace contractor muttered over stacks of data. Dr. Marcus Hale, the Navy's lead civilian consultant on the project, was pacing like a man caught between genius and frustration. "I'm telling you," Hale barked at a technician. "If the computer says airflow is fine, then airflow is fine. We need to look deeper into the engine core." Hazel's fingers curled around the edge of her vest to stop herself from blurting out that computers can't always see the same things eyes can. She didn't have a doctorate or decades in the field, but she'd seen enough engines to know numbers could lie if the setup was wrong. Benjamin caught her staring at the intakes. "Something on your mind," he murmured. She hesitated. "Dad." If the wings push air in a certain way, and the intakes are angled differently, couldn't the air get messed up before it reaches the turbine? Before Benjamin could answer, Lieutenant Harper Green, one of the few officers who seemed open to unorthodox ideas, walked past and caught the tail end of her question. "Say that again." Hazel repeated it, slower this time. Green's brow furrowed. "That actually lines up with a pressure anomaly I've been trying to explain for days." "Doctor," Hale overheard and turned sharply. "Pressure anomaly. Why wasn't this in my report?" Green stiffened. "Because it didn't fit the existing hypothesis." "Sir." The consultant waved a dismissive hand. "We're not here to entertain every wild guess, especially from—" His gaze flicked toward Hazel. The implication clear. Benjamin's jaw tightened. But before he could speak, Hazel stepped forward just enough to be heard. "It's not a wild guess. If the air gets disturbed before it hits the fan blades, you lose thrust even if the engine's perfect. It's like trying to row a boat in water that's sloshing sideways." For a beat, no one spoke. Then Green cleared his throat. "Sir, I recommend we at least run a simulation based on her observation. It's a variable we haven't modeled yet." Morrison raised an eyebrow at Benjamin. "She's your kid." Benjamin's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Yeah, she tends to notice things. Dr." Hale sighed heavily, clearly torn between protecting his authority and acknowledging a point he couldn't outright refute. "Fine. Run your model. But if it shows nothing, we go back to my plan." As Green hurried off to input the parameters, Morrison motioned Benjamin aside. "If she's right, you realize this means 30 of us have been chasing the wrong problem for 3 days straight." Benjamin glanced over at Hazel, who was standing quietly now, her eyes still fixed on the VX-92's intake geometry. "Sometimes," he said, "it's not about who's the smartest in the room, it's about who's looking at the right thing." For the first time since the VX-92 crisis began, the air in the hangar felt a fraction lighter. Not because the problem was solved yet, but because, for the first time, someone had dared to look in a different direction. The hum of computers filled the simulation lab, a windowless room buried deep in the operations wing of Naval Air Station Halifax. Hazel sat at a corner workstation beside Lieutenant Harper Green, the two of them surrounded by monitors displaying airflow models of the VX-92. She had been told firmly that she was only here to watch. But Green had a way of quietly sliding a keyboard closer when no one was looking. "Dr." Marcus Hale stood behind them with his arms crossed, the skeptical posture of a man already preparing to say, "I told you so." Benjamin watched from near the door, his navy blues crisp, but his expression unreadable. "All right," Green said, fingers moving over the keys. "We'll start with the baseline level flight at 250 knots, no thrust anomalies." The wireframe model of the VX-92 appeared on screen, colored bands indicating airflow. It looked perfect, clean laminar flow into both engine intakes. "Now," Hazel said quietly, "try increasing to high-speed climb 350 knots and tilt the nose up just a little more than standard." Green adjusted the parameters. The model shifted, airflow streaming smoothly until it didn't. Pockets of turbulent red blossomed along the wing roots, right where they met the air intakes. "There it is," Hazel whispered. Green froze the simulation. "Flow separation," he said, tapping the screen. Air's being redirected by the wing's leading edge and hitting the intake at a bad angle. At high speed, that could starve the engine of usable airflow even if it's spinning perfectly. Hale stepped closer, frowning. That turbulence could be an artifact of the model, or it could be exactly what's happening in the real world. Green interrupted. "Sir, This aligns with the pressure anomalies in the flight data. We never saw it in ground tests because the plane wasn't moving through air fast enough to create the problem. Benjamin moved to stand beside them, so all our diagnostics missed it because we were looking at stationary conditions. Hazel looked up from the screen, and the computer didn't flag it because it doesn't know to look there. Hale let out a long breath, as if conceding more than he wanted. Assume for a moment she's right. What's the fix? Modifying the intake lips or adding vortex generators to redirect airflow? Green said. Could be temporary until a redesign. But we'd need to confirm with a live ground run under simulated airspeed. Morrison's voice came from the doorway. You've got one shot at this. The NATO demo is in 72 hours. If you can prove it's airflow, I'll authorize modifications. Benjamin glanced at his daughter. You hear that? Hazel. That's the sound of a maybe. 2 hours later. The VX-92 sat at the far end of the hangar. Nose pointed toward a massive portable wind generator, an ugly, roaring machine capable of blasting hurricane-force air. The team crowded behind the safety line, headsets on, eyes locked on the jet. Spool her up, Morrison ordered. The twin engines ignited with a deep, rising growl. On the monitors, the thrust readouts climbed. At first, everything looked normal. Then the wind generators roared to life, simulating the high-speed climb conditions from the model. Almost instantly, the thrust dropped hard. The same baffling failure they'd seen in the air repeated itself right there on the ground. Kill the wind, Morrison barked. The thrust jumped back to normal. Every head turned toward Hazel. She just shrugged. Guess that's your airflow. Even Hale looked begrudgingly impressed. Green, start drafting the modification specs. If we can redirect that turbulence, we might salvage the demonstration. Benjamin put a hand on Hazel's shoulder. You realize you just solved a problem 30 of the best engineers in the Navy couldn't crack in 3 days. Hazel smirked. Took me longer than I thought. Green laughed. You've got a future in aerospace if you want it. She shook her head. I don't want to design planes. I want to fix them when they break. By midnight, the engineering team had sketched a temporary solution: small head, curved metal vanes mounted ahead of each intake to straighten the disturbed airflow. Not elegant, but effective if the theory held up. As the modifications began, Benjamin watched his daughter chatting with Green, her hands sketching ideas on a scrap of paper like she'd been part of the squad for years. He thought about how close they'd come to ignoring her, simply because she didn't fit the definition of expert. If the test worked tomorrow, it wouldn't just save the VX-92 program, it would be a reminder to him, to Hale, to everyone that sometimes the right answer comes from the least expected place. The next morning, the Atlantic wind came in cold and sharp, tugging at the edges of the tarps draped over the VX-92. The modified intake vanes, freshly fabricated from lightweight alloy, gleamed silver against the jet's darker skin. Hazel stood just outside the safety line, her bright orange vest marking her as a visitor. But her posture was anything but passive. She had the same focused expression Benjamin had seen in the mirror before every important mission. Lieutenant Harper Green joined her, a clipboard tucked under one arm. Nervous. Hazel shook her head. Not for me. But if this doesn't work, you guys are back to square one. Benjamin, already strapped into a headset on the flight line, glanced over at his daughter. Hazel, you've already done the hard part. Now it's just proving it. The engines started with their familiar, rising growl. Hazel could feel it in her chest, a vibration that seemed to connect her directly to the machine. The massive wind generators spun up again, mimicking the airspeed that had killed thrust yesterday. On the monitors inside the mobile control station, the thrust readouts held steady. No sudden drop, no red warning lights. The intake vanes were doing their job, feeding clean, stable air straight into the turbines. Green let out a breath he'd clearly been holding. We've got stable thrust across the envelope. Airflow's clean. Hale leaned over the display, his earlier skepticism softened by what looked suspiciously like admiration. "I'll be damned. The kid nailed it." Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. "Bring her up to full climb power." The engine surged, the VX-92 holding steady as the simulated climb continued. Still no thrust loss. Hazel's shoulders relaxed. For the first time since stepping into the hangar last night. She allowed herself to smile, not the cocky grin she'd worn when sketching her idea, but a small, quiet smile of satisfaction. Benjamin walked back from the safety area after the test, helmet under his arm. "Well, Hazel," he said, "the Navy owes you one." "I don't want anything," she replied simply. "Just promise you won't stop looking at the simple stuff first." Morrison approached, extending a hand to her. "Miss Cole, you just saved us a diplomatic disaster. NATO gets their demo, and my blood pressure might actually drop below critical levels." Hazel shook his hand awkwardly. "I'm glad it worked. But honestly, it was kind of obvious once you thought about it." That earned her a chorus of laughs from the engineering crew. Even Hale cracked a smile. "You'll make a lot of friends in this line of work talking like that," he said dryly. Later, as the hangar cleared out, Green handed Hazel the printed airflow charts from the simulation and the live test. "Keep these. You earned them." She studied the colored diagrams, yesterday's turbulence in angry reds, today's clean flow in calm blues and greens. "It's funny," she said. "All that fancy equipment, and the answer was just air not going where it should." Benjamin placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the simple explanations are the hardest to see. People get so caught up in data that they forget to look." As they left the base, the ocean wind whipping across the tarmac. Hazel glanced back at the VX-92 one more time. She felt taller somehow, not because of what she'd done, but because she'd proven to herself that her way of thinking had value, even here, among the Navy's best. For Benjamin, the pride ran deeper than the solved problem. He'd watched his daughter stand in a room full of experts, offer an idea they didn't ask for, and hold her ground until they listened. That wasn't just mechanical skill, that was courage. And for Hazel, this was no longer just about fixing engines. It was about knowing that when something didn't make sense, she had the right to speak up, even if every credential in the room said otherwise. The sun was dipping low over Seabright Harbor when Benjamin pulled the truck into their driveway. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, and the gulls were making their last noisy rounds before roosting for the night. Hazel climbed out with her backpack slung over one shoulder, the printed airflow charts still tucked inside. She hadn't let go of them since Lieutenant Green handed them over. Caleb was waiting on the porch, a mug of coffee in one hand. "So," he said, leaning on the railing, "did my granddaughter save the Navy today?" Hazel gave a lopsided smile. "I guess so. They didn't exactly throw me a parade." Benjamin chuckled as he stepped past them. "Parades aren't the point, kiddo. Planes flying when they're supposed to, that's the point." Inside, the warmth of the house was a welcome contrast to the cold outside. Caleb cleared a space on the kitchen table, and Hazel spread out the charts for him to see. He studied them, his eyes narrowing at the red turbulence zones on yesterday's model and the clean blue channels on today's. "Well," he said finally, "you caught something 30 professionals didn't? That's not luck. That's knowing where to look." Hazel shrugged. But there was a quiet pride in the motion. "I just thought about what Grandpa always says. Look at what's actually happening, not what the machine thinks is happening." Benjamin leaned against the counter, watching the two of them. "You know," he said, "you didn't just fix an engine problem. You reminded a whole bunch of people, including me, that sometimes the answer comes from outside the circle we draw around expertise." Hazel tilted her head. "Is that your Navy way of saying you were wrong?" He laughed. "It's my Navy way of saying you're officially part of the solution." The next morning, word of Hazel's role in the fix had started to make the rounds in town. At the Lighthouse Grill, regulars were already swapping an embellished version of the story Hazel as the girl who fixed the Navy's billion-dollar jet with a napkin sketch. She blushed every time someone mentioned it, but she didn't correct them. Later that week, the VX-92 lifted off for its NATO demonstration. Hazel and Caleb watched from the harbor breakwater as the sleek aircraft roared overhead, climbing into the clear autumn sky. No stumbles, no sudden loss of thrust, just smooth, unstoppable power. They listened, Caleb said softly, the pride in his voice as clear as the gulls overhead. Hazel's eyes stayed on the shrinking silhouette. Yeah. They listened. That evening, Benjamin returned from the base with a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter of thanks from Captain Morrison, along with a small brass challenge coin stamped with the VX-92 insignia. Hazel turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight. "It's not a medal," Benjamin said, "but in the Navy, this means something. It's a way of saying you're part of the crew." Hazel closed her fingers around the coin. "Then I guess I'll have to earn a few more." Benjamin exchanged a glance with Caleb, both of them smiling. They knew this was just the beginning. Hazel might never wear a uniform, but she'd already proven she belonged in any room where problems needed solving. Outside, the harbor lights blinked on one by one, reflecting in the dark water. The world went about its business boats rocking in their slips, gulls settling on pilings, the wind carrying the smell of the sea through every street in Seabright. But for the Cole family, the week's events had left a quiet, unshakable truth. Brilliance isn't about titles or degrees. It's about the courage to speak up when you see the answer, even if no one's asking you for it. Hazel's simple but sharp observation not only solved the VX-92's mystery, it also reminded every technician and engineer on that project that skill and insight aren't bound by age or rank. Word of her role traveled far beyond the base, turning her into an unexpected symbol of curiosity and determination in Seabright Harbor. For the Navy crew, she became proof that sometimes the most valuable team member is the one no one expected. For the community, she was living proof that courage, observation, and a willingness to speak up can inspire change in places that once seemed untouchable. Hazel's achievement proved that intelligence and technical skill aren't defined by age or job title. Her clear, persistent thinking showed that sometimes the right answer comes from unexpected places, and that fresh perspectives can break through the toughest problems. Her success didn't just fix a jet engine, it inspired everyone around her to listen more openly and value ideas on their merit, not their source. The end? Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep building with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe every voice deserves to be heard.